Chapter 7. The Conclusions of Others on Ancient Israel. Lachish. There have been a number of studies done on the Lachish skulls. The studies conducted by Kieta in 1988 and by Uehlinger and colleagues in 2005 stand out. The former was based on skull measurements, while the latter concentrated on discrete features of the teeth. Just as the skull has bumps and grooves which reveal something of the owner's genetic heritage, so do the teeth. Since the present author has made his own conclusions on the Lachish skulls, it pays to investigate the conclusions of these studies. Skulls. Uehlinger and colleagues studied the teeth of skulls from two Israeli archaeological sites, Lachish and Dothan. They started by giving a robust summary of previous studies on Lachish skull measurements. In the introduction, they inform us that, utilizing craniometrics, Risden, 1939, concluded that the group was very similar to dynastic Egyptian material. In fact, he stated that the entire population was of foreign origin, representing descendants of a group derived primarily from Upper Egypt. This conclusion was subsequently supported by a craniometric study by Musgrave and Evans, 1981. Kieta, 1988, page 377, likewise examined the skulls metrically, omitting those that were either artificially deformed, female, warped, split, or juvenile, using only those measurements that he believed were consistent population discriminators. He concluded that the group was fairly heterogeneous, having close relationships to North African, Egyptian, and Nubian groups, thus lending support to an Egypto-Nubian presence. Kieta, 1988, page 388, page 468. AJPA 128, 2005. Bioarchaeological Analysis of Cultural Transition in the Southern Levant Using Dental Non-Metric Traits by J.M. Uehlinger et al. What Risden actually said was that Lachish skulls were closest to 18th dynasty Upper Egyptians as opposed to pre-dynastic Upper Egyptians. The difference was that the 18th dynasty skulls were less prognathic and more wider-skulled, as if influenced by the Lower Egyptians. Kieta concluded that Egyptians and Nubians were probably present in Lachish based on the skull measurements. He also cited the Bible as evidence that Egypto-Nubians were fighting the Assyrians, eventually destroyers of the Lachish, in Judah. Kieta saw great variety in the skulls of Lachish. He ran an individual skull analysis to see which geographical group the Lachish skulls would class into. Lachish was one of the options in this analysis. Kieta reported, "The reclassification results show the Lachish series to have the greatest number of misclassifications, with only 39.3% being correctly classified. Approximately 31% misclassified into coastal North African and Northern Egyptian series, and 30% into Southern Egyptian, Nubian, and Tropical African series." Kieta, 1988, page 384. A second classifying analysis, without the option of Lachish, was run by Kieta. In the unknown analysis, approximately half classified into Northern Egyptian, coastal North African, and European series, and the other half into Southern Egyptian, Nubian, and other Tropical African series. Kieta, 1988, page 384. These results are certainly in keeping with our conclusions on the Lachish skulls that they were of Afro-Euro type with a dominant Afro-type component. If anything, they suggest a predominant Afro-type component. Let us look at the groups Lachish skulls classed into with the benefit of another Kieta paper to help interpret. Studies of Ancient Crania from Northern Africa by S.O.I. Kieta in AJPA 83, 1990, pages 35 through 48. Tropical African is essentially Sub-Saharan African. Nubian is essentially a Saharan-type African. Southern Egyptian, particularly if pre-dynastic, is another Saharan-type African. Northern Egyptian appears to be a mixture of Saharan-type African with Euro-type, Kieta 1990. Coastal North African also appears to be another mixture of Saharan type with Eurotype, Chieta 1990. From a geographical point of view, this makes perfect sense. Chieta's study strongly suggests that half of Lachish classed into mixed Afro-Eurotype, while the other half classed into Saharan-type African. We should remember that Saharan-type Africans are not a different race from sub-Saharan Africans. The traits that they have also occur in sub-Saharans, but in lower frequencies. The former originate from the latter, and both have heavily pigmented skins. Teeth. The conclusion of the Uehlinger and colleagues' teeth study has been interpreted by some as contradicting the Chieta study. The results of this dental morphology study indicate biological continuity in the Late Bronze Early Iron Age transition in the southern Levant. The similarity between Tel Dothan and Lachish suggests that the two are more closely related to each other than to other sites in the Mediterranean region. The data also indicate that the group at Lachish may be more homogeneous than previously thought, while the individuals in the family tomb at Dothan may have been influenced by peoples from the Mediterranean. Page 474. Does it really? It speaks of greater Mediterranean influence at Dothan, which is further north and, therefore, not surprising. It speaks of continuity in the current region of Israel. Any region which has not suffered a violent invasion and extermination of the population will likely show continuity. This is the case with Egypt also. Why? It is because the population changes have been gradual and dual in nature. On the one hand, the first settled people in Upper Egypt, the Badarians, 4500 BC, are reported by Chieta to have been tropically adapted. The implication is that they were arrivals from further the tropical rather than subtropical zone. They had nasal heights of around 47.1. Egypt is in the subtropical zone and has colder winter temperatures than the tropics. Over 1,000 or 2,000 year period changes took place amongst the Upper Egyptians. The nasal heights of Nakadans, 3500 BC, and Abydos Egyptians, 3100 BC, are 51.3 and 53.2 respectively. The reference is Chieta 1988, page 383. The increase in nasal height can be explained by an adaptation to the colder winter temperatures in a dry climate if we take the correlations of Hoob et al. 2009 into account. The maximum cranial breadth also increased from 132.2 during the Badarian to 134.7 Nakadan, and then 136.2 during the First Dynasty. This can be seen as part of the same adaptation. Both nasal height and maximum skull breadth were changing. During the 26th to 30th dynasty, maximum skull breadth was 139.5, but the nasal height, 52.8, had decreased from the First Dynasty. An explanation would be if the difference, after the First Dynasty, was not because of local evolution, but the steady trickle of Asiatic settlers from more northern regions from the late Old Kingdom onwards. There is abundant evidence from contemporary Egyptian literature for these population movements. The Europeans in the Howells database had lower nasal heights than Abydos Egyptians and wider maximum skull breadths. A contribution to Lower Egypt from a Eurotype population would account better for the change we see in Egypt when comparing First Dynasty to late Lower Dynastic skulls. It is highly likely that a similar process was taking place in Syro-Palestine, and that the South was the last part to experience the change from predominant Afro-type to dominant Eurotype mixture. There was continuity of both population and archaeology in Egypt and Israel, with the occasional invasion, but it was never followed by extermination. In conclusion, the Uehlinger et al. Paper in no way invalidates the evidence of subtropical adaptation of the Lachish population, and this being the dominant component. Hellenistic and Roman Judea. Reconstruction testimony. No study is complete without dealing with the potentially opposing arguments. In recent years, reconstructions of biblical period Judeans have been conducted. The results have received plenty of media attention. The present report deals with reconstructing the facial shapes of ancient inhabitants of Israel based on their cranial remains. The skulls of a male from the Hellenistic period and a female from the Roman period have been reconstructed. They were restored using the most recently developed programs in anthropological facial reconstruction, especially that of the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Facial image of biblical Jews from Israel by E. Kobyliansky, T. Beluva, E. Vasilovskaya, B. Ahrensberg, in Anthropologischer Anzeiger 66-2, 2008, page 167. We should always bear some things in mind when looking at a reconstruction. 1. The complexion and hair are given at the discretion of the reconstructor. 2. The degree of broadness of the nose and thickness of the lips are influenced by the reconstructor's perception of the geographical grouping to which the skeleton belonged. Reconstruction guidelines for the noses of skulls designated Negroid are a few millimeters more than those for designated Caucasoid. As a result of this, if a skull has a nasal breadth of 27, then it will receive a narrower, reconstructed nose if they think it belonged to a white person than if they think the owner was black or of black heritage. In short, the preconceptions of the reconstructor will dominate the appearance of the reconstruction. Did they use Caucasoid or Negroid reconstructing guidelines? Width of nose and mouth were calculated according to the equations of regression. These equations were formulated by us earlier when researching populations of European origin. Kobyliansky et al., 2008, page 173. The real question, however, is whether the skeletal evidence of the reconstructed individual supports that conclusion. Both skulls were mesocephalic. We are told of the first, a Hellenistic period male. The nasal curvature is straight and the nasal spine is well developed. The nasal breadth is of medium size. Notably, the nose is prominent, long, and the nasal bridge is high. The alveolar prognathism points to more protruding lips. The set of attributes of an alveolar part enabled us to reconstruct a wide mouth with a low and prominent upper lip, with slightly swelling lip blooms. Kobyliansky et al., 2008, page 178 through 181. This is a combination of Eurotype and Afrotype skeletal features of the face. If anything, they should have used both European and African regression equations to calculate the nose and lip size, and then implemented an intermediate reconstruction to reflect the obvious mixed heritage. They actually admit the Afro-Eurotype heritage of the Roman period woman. They describe her in the following. Her face is oval, low, with a sharp horizontal and vertical profile of medium width. The nasal and gnathic parts of the face are prominent, and prognathism is strongly developed. The nose is prominent, short, and of medium breadth. Having a set of the features of an alveolar part of the face enabled us to reconstruct a big mouth with a high and prominent upper lip and plump lip blooms. Based on the description of the skull and the reconstructed facial peculiarities of the woman, we may conclude that she certainly belongs to a Caucasoid type, however, with some original features of an equatorial group. At the same time, this person had a very original beauty characterized by a combination of European features with the southern equatorial ones considered plump. Kobyliansky et al., 2008, pages 185 and 186. The only difference between the man and woman is that the man has a dominant Eurotype component in his mixture, whereas the woman has an equal amount of the two components. It does not seem justified to conclude that she belongs to the Caucasoid group. Judging from the percentages of prognathism and platyrrhiny we saw in chapters 4 and 5, she was far from the only one with an equal blend in the Roman period. Conclusion. The conclusion of Chieta is that half of the skull sample from Lachish, Judah has southern affinities like southern Egyptians and Nubians. The other half has affinities with coastal North Africans and northern Egyptians. The northerners are themselves a mix of European-like skulls and tropical African-like skulls, and those with both characteristics. This strongly suggests that the Lachish skulls were half Afrotype and half semi-Afrotype. Alternatively, we could conclude that 3/4 of the population were Afrotype and 1/4 were Eurotype. Uehlinger and colleagues' conclusion that Lachish was probably homogeneous in their ancestry might support the former. We do not see the Lachish population as expatriate, but as representing the native Hebrew population. The Engedi skulls seem like the Lachish skulls, but with a higher Eurotype component, an equal blend in the Hellenistic period becoming more Eurotype in the Roman period. Chieta's conclusions are broadly consistent with our own findings. The reconstructions of a Hellenistic period skull and a Roman period skull from Engedi show a blend of Eurotype and Afrotype traits. In the former, there were more Eurotype traits, but in the latter there was an even blend. Unfortunately, this reality did not inform the reconstruction itself, resulting in the reconstructions looking more Eurotype than they should. The skeletal traits recorded by the forensic anthropologists are broadly consistent with our own conclusions. Conclusion. Most forensic anthropologists use anywhere between 14 and 40 measurements to determine ancestry in a skull. We have found that only a few consistently separate African from European populations, and that these are most suitable to apply to ancient Israeli skulls. Geographically, Israel is located on the doorstep of Africa, so African affinity should really come as no surprise, even though for many it almost certainly does. The maximum skull breadth, horizontal circumference, biauricular breadth, bizygomatic breadth, and nasal indices all strongly suggest an Afro-Eurotype population with a dominant Afrotype component. The Miss Israel of 2014 is probably the best approximation of what the Lachish Judah people looked like. The Judeans of the Hellenistic period were an equal blend of Afro and Eurotype and probably approximated the appearance of Barack Obama. Discrete nasal traits of nasal spine, bridge, root, and sill all supported a mixed population, with some favoring a stronger Afro-type component and others a Euro-type component. Other discrete traits such as alveolar prognathism and orbit shape support this conclusion. 10 discrete skull traits were also reviewed, and the evidence strongly suggests that the ancient Lachish population had a stronger sub-Saharan and Saharan African than European affinity. It also suggests that the Judean Hellenistic and Roman period populations had a clear African affinity. The conclusion of previous studies all show Lachish skulls to have tropical, subtropical, and mixed affinities. They broadly agree with our own conclusions. The forensic evidence is proof of the assertion made in Volume 1 that the biblical Old Testament Hebrews were black and progressively became mixed from the transition of the Old Testament period to the Roman period. This has been The Ancient Black Hebrews, Volume 2,